In an Antarctica documentary by Werner Herzog, the camera watches a colony of penguins do what penguins always do: march, shuffle, single file, one direction, the ocean. Then the camera finds one. One penguin stops, looks around, and turns, inland, toward the mountains, toward nothing that feeds a penguin. The internet turned that bird into a meme, a symbol of burnout, a joke about choosing the wrong path. But here is the version people never sit with. Sometimes the animal is not broken. Sometimes the environment changed. Sometimes the ocean stopped being safe. Today, we're dissecting a country that might be doing the penguin walk, not because it lost its mind, because the ocean started acting like a gatekeeper. We're going to break down three things: the dependency that makes Canada fragile, the trigger that made it flinch, and the 5-month countdown that turns a trade spat into a structural reckoning. Welcome to the most polite crisis in North American trade. Most people hear Canada trades with America, and they picture lumber and maple syrup. That is not the story. Canada does not trade heavily with the United States because of warm feelings. It trades heavily because geography made it unavoidable. The pipelines point south. The rail corridors point south. The factories were built within trucking distance of a border that used to be boring. The result is a dependency so deep that calling it a trade relationship undersells it. It is integration, wiring, a circulatory system built over decades and calibrated to one destination. In 2024, the United States was the destination for approximately 75.9% of Canada's total merchandise exports. That comes from Statistics Canada. Let that number land. 3/4 of everything Canada sells to the world moves through one gate, one buyer, one border. This is not just raw materials. This is finished goods, auto parts crossing the border multiple times before they end up in a vehicle, energy, agricultural products priced for American shelves, an entire manufacturing ecosystem optimized around the assumption that the border stays open and stays cheap. Dependency is not automatically dangerous. Plenty of countries lean on a dominant trade partner and do fine for generations. The danger kicks in when the dominant partner starts attaching conditions to the access, when the gate has a lock and someone starts making noise about using it. At that point, dependency stops being gravity, it becomes leverage. If you run a business and 75% of your revenue comes from a single client, you are not diversified, you're employed. The moment that client starts telling you who else you can work with, you are not a partner, you're on a leash. That is not an insult, it's a structure. And structures produce consequences, whether or not you like the language. So the baseline on Canada in 2026 is not what it wants, it's what it cannot easily change. When your entire economic circulatory system flows in one direction, even a minor disruption at the border backs up the whole body. That's the patient's chart before anything happens. Now let me show you what happened. In mid-January 2026, Mark Carney's government announced a reset in Canada's trade relationship with China. There were several moving pieces: diplomatic language, framework talk, the usual choreography. But one detail cut through everything else. Canada would allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles to enter the country at the standard tariff rate of 6.1%. That might not sound dramatic until you remember what came before it. Canada had previously imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, a wall, and now Ottawa was rolling part of that wall back. You can argue whether the policy is smart. You can argue whether 49,000 vehicles is a meaningful number or a rounding error dressed up as diplomacy. But you cannot argue what it signals. Ottawa is trying to create options. It's doing what any entity does when it realizes its supply chain has a single point of failure. It starts looking around. This is where the story gets sharp. Canada did not make this move in a vacuum. The American position was clear. U.S. officials said those cars would not be allowed to enter the United States. So when Canada opened even a narrow door to those same vehicles, the optics were immediate. Canada was not just diversifying, it was doing something its biggest trade partner had specifically refused to do. And in trade, the thing that matters is not what you intended, it's what the other side perceived. What the other side perceived was a crack in the North American wall against Chinese industrial goods, and cracks in the current American posture don't get polite memos, they get hammered. Quick pause. If you're watching this and thinking it doesn't affect you because you don't live in Canada, hold that thought. The mechanism we're about to describe, one dominant buyer threatening to cut access over a third-party relationship, is not a Canadian story, it's a template, and templates travel. The hammer came fast. On January 24, 2026, Donald Trump threatened a 100% tariff on Canadian goods if Canada proceeds with a trade deal with China. 100%, not 10, not 25, a full doubling of the price on everything Canada sends south. In practice, a 100% tariff functions less like bargaining and more like a wall. And a wall doesn't have to last forever, it only has to exist long enough to break the machinery. Modern trade is systems, parts crossing borders multiple times in a single production cycle, contracts priced on margins so thin that a small shift triggers renegotiation, factories calibrated to predictable movement. Double the price at the border and you don't create a negotiation, you snap the chain. Then, on February 2, 2026, Trump reiterated the threat, framing it as a very substantial response, not softer, not walked back, repeated. Repeating in trade threats is not noise, it's signal. It tells every business on both sides of the border to start running scenarios. What if this is real? What if it lasts a quarter? What do we do with inventory, with contracts, with the people who pack and ship and assemble and invoice? Here's what most people miss. A tariff threat doesn't have to be enacted to cause damage. The threat itself is the weapon. Businesses adjust the moment the probability shifts. They delay investment. They cancel expansions. They push pause on hiring. The cost starts accruing not the day the tariff takes effect, but the day the market believes it might. And who pays? Not the officials drafting the memos. The cost lands on the warehouse manager who can't commit to next quarter's inventory order. The parts supplier in Ontario deciding whether to run a second shift or start laying people off. The logistics company choosing right now whether to sign a lease on a cross-border facility. These are not theoretical people. They absorb trade uncertainty in their sleep schedules and their mortgage payments. Canada reaches towards China, America raises a wall, and every business caught in the middle starts doing arithmetic nobody wanted to do. Now, here's what turns this from a headline into a countdown. There's a clock, and it's already running. On July 1, 2026, the USMCA hits its first major joint review under Article 34.7, 5 months from now, and the timing couldn't be worse for Canada. A joint review is not a casual check-in, it's a forcing event, the institutional moment where the largest partner gets to set the agenda, raise grievances, attach conditions, say out loud what has only been implied in press conferences. If you're Canada walking into that review with a fresh China reset in your pocket and a 100% tariff threat in your ears, you're not negotiating from strength, you're negotiating from exposure. This is what makes the next 5 months so dangerous. Every move Canada makes between now and July gets read through 2 lenses. Beijing watches to see if Canada follows through. Washington watches to see if Canada folds. And Canada tries to thread a needle so narrow the thread is probably on fire. The review matters for a deeper reason, too. USMCA was built with enforcement teeth, rules of origin, labor provisions, automotive content requirements, all designed to keep the North American supply chain North American. When Canada opens a door to Chinese vehicles, it doesn't just raise a trade question, it raises a compliance question. And compliance questions inside a treaty review become leverage, not the loud kind, the procedural kind, the kind that gets written into annexes and side letters and becomes permanent.
Canada is not just managing a trade dispute, it is managing a trade dispute 5 months before the exam, and the examiner is the country threatening to double the tariff. So what does Canada actually do? Strip away the politics, strip away the national pride, strip away the hot takes and the people who have never read a trade agreement suddenly having opinions about rules of origin. 3 paths, none comfortable. Path 1. Canada slows the China reset, pulls back, goes into the July review with clean hands and a message that says we are still committed to North American integration. The advantage is obvious, lower immediate risk, supply chains exhale. But the cost is also obvious. You have just demonstrated that your biggest trade partner can pressure you to abandon your other relationships with a single threat. Every future partner, not just China, now knows that any deal with Ottawa comes with an American asterisk. That asterisk does not go away, it gets priced in. Path 2. Canada commits to the pivot, accepts the pain, absorbs whatever tariff response comes, and starts building a genuine multi-year strategy to reduce exposure. Not speeches, actual infrastructure, new Pacific port capacity, new trade corridors that do not run south. The advantage is long-term resilience. A country that trades meaningfully with multiple partners is harder to coerce. But you cannot rewire an economy built around one border in a single budget cycle. You probably cannot do it in 5. Every month of that transition is a month where businesses bleed, workers adjust, and voters grow impatient. Pivots sound bold in speeches. They feel like recessions on the ground. Path 3. The narrow middle. Canada keeps the China deal, but limits it so tightly that Washington cannot credibly call it a backdoor. Hard compliance on rules of origin, maximum transparency on where parts come from and where vehicles end up, a quota small enough that the direct economic impact could be limited, but the diplomatic signal is preserved. One goal: convince Washington that Canada is not a conduit for Chinese goods entering North America through the side door. Because if Washington believes Canada is functioning as a conduit, the response will not be a tariff threat, it will be structural, written into the treaty. And structural changes do not get reversed with a phone call. None of these paths are safe. That's the point. When dependency reaches a certain depth and the dominant partner tests the limits of that leverage, there is no clean move, only the least ugly one. Now come back to the penguin. The meme says the bird is walking away from food, but in this story, the food is not the American market. The food is stable access, predictable access, access that does not come with a phone call at midnight telling you which relationships are acceptable. Maybe the penguin is confused, or maybe it sensed a current the rest of the colony refused to acknowledge, a shift, a new threat offshore. The colony keeps marching because marching is what colonies do, but one bird turns because its risk model updated faster than the group. That is Canada in 2026. Not heroism, not self-destruction, a response to a market that started behaving like a gatekeeper. I know this was heavy, but the lesson is not about Canada specifically. It's about what happens to any entity, a country, a company, a person, when 3/4 of its lifeline runs through one door and the person holding the door starts setting terms. The math does not care about flags, it cares about options. The fewer you have, the more someone else's mood becomes your economy. Drop your answer in the comments. Not pro-America, not pro-China, simple. Which is more dangerous, a risky pivot or a lifeline that can be cut on command? Next time, we're looking at another country that tried to walk away from its biggest trade partner. That story ended differently. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you think I'm being dramatic, remember, the penguin was not dramatic either. He just turned around, and nobody stopped him.